right, so thanks again for showing up today. We really do appreciate your participation, and I'm going to hand it over to Brad. Feel free to put any questions that you have during the presentation in the chat, and I will monitor those as we go along. This is recorded, and I will upload this recording along with all of the chat notes and any other details, and Brad, if you're willing, the PowerPoint into our Google Drive and make sure that's available on the Transformation Network website. And of course, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. I am here to support you. So thank you so much, Brad.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And as you may have seen, I have a bit of a cough, and so I may on occasion mute my mic, but that's just so that you don't have to have me cough in your ear. And thanks everybody for joining. I know I caused a bit of a change in when the meeting was going to be because of some scheduling conflicts I have. So I appreciate everybody adapting to that. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. And I realized I didn't really do an agenda slide. So what are we going to cover in this? So I want to give you a sense of the flow that might help with answering some questions that may develop right away. And hopefully I may get to them towards the end. So what I really want to do is talk about why we might think about community issues guides as a tool and place that discussion within the TN. And then what are issue guides? And then what would we do to sort of implement and sort of adopt an issue guide approach within the TN? So sort of a why, a what, and a how flow for this. So hopefully this diagram should look familiar. It is sort of, the goal of the project is to really accomplish guided transformation using SES and STR and SETS theories to move communities from one, what I would say, a current basin of attraction to another that's either desired or a better basin. And I think we refer to those as states within the TN. I may refer to states as organizational entities, so I just kind of wanted to make that clarification a little bit too. But it's really about the science associated with these different states, basins of attraction. And then we're also built around community engagement and how do we use co-creation and that community engagement as appropriate for any of our specific projects and charters. So sort of the two main themes as I see them that relate to the project and to what I'm going to talk about. So our project, I think various versions of these, but you've seen that we've got core themes, which are the rows. We've got cross-cutting threads, and I pulled this from an older document, so it may not be quite up to date, but we have these. We did an exercise of where everybody's charter kind of fits across these. And then as part of the community engagement, we asked you about what audiences are you working engagement, and that was, are you working at kind of the local community member, tribal, indigenous, community-based, or extension offices, and kind of up into that policymaker, legislative body. So sort of a progression of frontline individuals to maybe more policy setters. And then we asked you, okay, well, within that, how are you engaging with community? Sort of what's the level of engagement going from outreach all the way up to shared leadership? So that's sort of where community engagement has been trying to connect and fit into the broader. And so now kind of want to talk a little bit of how do we integrate all this back together and think about guided transformations. So how do we bridge charters, exemplars, core themes, cross-cutting threads into new sustainable urban regional system states? And what I want to propose and sort of talk about is how can we apply learnings from the Kettering Foundation to this, and then how do we maybe adapt processes developed by the National Issue Forums Institute. And Kettering and NIFI, as I will refer to them, were very tightly held organizations. They work together very closely. They have just started to split, and we'll get a little bit, I may get a little bit into what that implies, but I don't think it's an important component for how we would engage from a TN with them. So Kettering was really engaged in the research side of these project. And so what did they found out? They found that one of the reasons citizens often avoid getting involved in public issues is that what they hear from the professionals, and those professionals were politicians, issue analysts, news reporters, others, which I might say science professionals, what they hear from them don't really seem to speak to their everyday lives. And that conventional professional discourse fails to identify the trade-off that citizens will inevitably face when they're dealing with these issues, right? So often if we put forward or others put forward policy briefings, it's here's strategy A, strategy B, strategy C, you go ahead and pick one. But science also indicates that whether we provide it or not, human beings make decisions based on weighing trade-offs of those activities. I know I do that, and it seems to be that, science says everybody's going to do that, whether they know what those trade-offs are or not. They will fill in that space. So one might start to think about maybe instead of just providing options, we need to help provide and showcase what some of those trade-offs might be. So some of the other findings is that there are really three classes of problems that the Kettering kind of put things into. Technical problems that they can be solved relatively unilaterally. Difficult, they're straightforward, but their solutions are known with known consequences. And then wicked, and a lot of us have heard of wicked problems. In their definition, these are social or cultural problems that are difficult or impossible to solve because they're complex and interconnected in nature. And so what Kettering had worked on is saying that, well, within this taxonomy, difficult problems generally benefit from deliberation and community engagement over, whereas they would postulate that wicked problems require such community deliberations to come forward with potential solutions. And so how did they kind of go about doing that, or what did they learn from that is, in the process of public deliberation, as Kettering would call it, or we might call it Kettering community engagement, or we might call it guided transformation, is you engage with the community to say, what concerns you about this issue? Given those concerns, what would you do about it? And then if that idea that they postulate worked, would it ease your concerns? And what are the downsides or trade-offs that we might have to tolerate from those choices? So that's sort of the framework that Kettering put together about what does it mean to have issue discussions and guided forums. So their companion agency, the National Issues Forums Institute, sort of developed a process by which you engage community in these type of conversations. And what they really talked about is that, it's the hosting forums or community dialogues. And that's where the work is done, where democracy comes alive and the people are put to work. And they're put forward, their process is you should have something that's neutrally moderated, that encourages positive interactions on a topic where people are not expected to agree, but they're encouraged to find a shared direction, right? And I think many of these difficult or wicked problems, that's where we would see what we're working on as a TN and a lot of societal issues reside. And that the outcomes, let me make sure I have this. Yes, sorry. That the outcomes from these guided transfer or these discussions are really a deeper understanding of the issue and the tensions within. These are what the community would get out of it. Insight and awareness into the different points of view. Which trade-offs is the group willing to accept, right? So you discuss not only the issue, concerns, but what are the trade-offs? And then you start getting to a starting point for citizen action. And that can be at the individual or at the collective level, at some of the political organizations or community organizations that we want to work with. And hopefully this can provide effective guidance to policymakers, right? And this is generalized, assuming the conversations are with the community, the end user, the community individuals. But there's no reason this really can't be adapted to thinking about different organizations or community that you start having these conversations with. But it gives you a sense of what the purpose of the process is of the forum. And the way they do this is they create issue guides to help with these discussions. And they're usually printed materials that present an overview of the public issue, the public problem. They present 3 to 4 possible approaches to the problem. And I think the important points being along with potential costs, consequences, and trade-offs that they're likely to result from any of the approaches. And then they're intended to help the forums have this discussion, have a focus on the issue, and deliberate about the possible courses of action. And some of these NIFI issue guides actually have companion videos that can provide an overview of the framework. And part of what they also develop is they'll develop an issue guide, and then they'll develop the facilitator's guide. How do you help facilitate these conversations? So with that, let's think about the how. What might this look like for the TN? And I postulate, is this the next phase of community engagement for the TN, and how might the TN support guided transformations with community, which is that that co-creation part, or that active part of working with community, not doing to community or for community. So guided transformation guides, right? So we could think about how do we create them. Create the overview of the problem. This is probably where the science component comes in. And what are the researchers seeing? How might you see it from the citizen's perspective based on where you're already engaged with community? You might engage community on putting together the overview of the problem. Really think through what are those 3 or 4 possible approaches to solving it. There's where we're starting to integrate the research and the citizens' understanding of the real world complexities they approach, and then laying out those costs, consequences, trade-offs that they should consider when they're potentially pursuing these different actions. And hopefully these are all, realms or issues around where is that guided state we're trying to help community get towards from their current state to that preferred state. And so sort of what's the scale that we could be thinking about how we do this, right? So we could think about a single charter, and do you do it for a single community, which would be a very tight discussion, tight forums, really based almost within that single charter and how they want to do their community engagement. Or it could be a single charter, and how do we think about taking this to more than one community throughout the TN network? Or we could think about 2 or more charters that integrate together, and how do we expand that action, right? So you could have 2 charters that are at the exemplar scale, you pull those together, and maybe you're working at dialogues within that exemplar region. Or it could be, charters that are kind of in a core theme or a cross-cutting thread that come together, and we want to have some guided transformation guides around that core theme and what are those charter topics that relate. And across these multiple charters, do we have these discussions within a single community, or do we do it on multiple communities within the TN, right? So you can have multiple scales of both charter engagement and community engagement that may seem to make sense either for the community or for the charters involved. So how would we do this? Sort of what we've been in discussion and thinking about is this the evolution of my role on the TN is to help support and lead this, and Jody, who is on the call with us too, is also being brought in to sort of help with this. She's got experience working with Kettering, working with extension, and sort of working with me in kind of that extension mode, community engagement. We've spoken with NIFI, and as I mentioned before, NIFI and Kettering are sort of starting to separate, and it used to be Kettering was very interested in the research of the democracy, and NIFI supported the issue guide development there and the running of them. Kettering's moving on to something else. NIFI is still extremely interested in this issue guide development and deliberative dialogues and supporting that. And as it turns out, as I think somewhat to our benefit, is they've kind of lost their core partner, and they're trying to find ways to, how do we engage with a research community to further these type of conversations, and what are those issues? And so I think they're ready to really engage with an entity like the TN to do trainings on how do you put issue guides together, how do you host forums. So we have the opportunity of supporting direct TN-based training, and or putting together community organization training that could include extension, which where one of the things we definitely would look to do around the process that can really build capacity either within the TN or as sort of a professional development for either faculty or students involved in the project. But also Jody and I would be very willing, and I see as our role is helping TN members who may not have the time or the inkling to go deep in the training to actually help walk you through the processes, if this seems to make sense. So how do we help translate your charter, your science, your issue into guided transformation guides? How can we work with you to support the forums and the deliberation in the community? And then, how do we sort of think about expanding or seeing, is there a greater team of the TN who wants to be involved in this? So Jody and I are kind of thinking we would be the core, but we really would welcome other members of the TN to join us in sort of developing out this process, building capacity in the TN, building these as products for the TN, and then where this might go from even possibly training in your communities where you live and work. So I think that was a really quick overview of concept, idea, and wanted to leave a lot of opportunity for discussion, Q&A, maybe thoughts. I know a few of you who are on here have projects that I think could be very relevant or interested. I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen so that people's faces can pop up, and we will go with that. How does that sound?
So have you used this tool personally, Brad, or anybody in your team?
I have not used it directly. I have used sort of concepts of it in sort of how we do sort of some community engagement, and then have part of others who I've worked with very closely have used kind of modified processes of this about, sort of how do you get the community in the room and try to get maybe some of the decision makers to step back and give community space to talk, because that can be one of the challenges of if who you bring into the room, do they dominate a conversation? And so we've had that kind of practical experience of how do you manage community forums and community dialogue.
Hey, Brad, how do you define community in this context?
Well, I Kettering would define it, group of residents. I think for us, I think we define it as needed, right? I mean, I could see, for example, some of the work coming out of the Yakima Basin that seemed to be working a lot with decision makers around water use. That might be the community, right? That where you're thinking you have people who are directly engaged in water allocation, water use. They may be a part of a community. Plus or minus, is it the people who are being impacted by how that water is being used, or what water is being used, where are withdrawals coming from. So I think it's up to us or up to the project to think about what community would be. And I would say maybe some of your work that you're doing as part of the TN would really help with thinking through, are there tiers of community that should be involved? Or is it you've got the residents who are the direct users, and you have policymakers or something who are observers or technical resources to some of these forums, but they're not actually there to participate. And that's a little bit of the nuance that my short answer to Philip's question of how you structure who's there and who's a resource versus a community participant may differ. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I would say it's who's the right entity of community for who's going to be impacted and who may make these guided transformations that we're hoping to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you.
Julie?
Hey, thanks, Brad. I hopped on a little bit late, so maybe you already went over this and I missed it. But I don't think you quite answered my question that's slightly similar to Philip's, but the developing the guided transformation guides, is the process of developing the guide the major piece of this, or is the guide itself the major piece of this?
Well, coming from extension, I would argue the major piece is actually engaging the community to decide where the state, the guided transformation, is going to end and supporting the processes to get there. Right.
So the guide is like a documentation of the process of getting there.
Right. Well, the guide lays out what, simplistically is what the charter would say the end state should be, and the sort of nuances of that, right? And what's the benefit of getting here versus, maybe status quo, some of the others. So you sort of lay out some options that the community may be thinking about, and you may be thinking about as a scientist. What are the pros and cons? That's a guide to help you have the conversation with community, which I think should occur. And then the outcome would be, if you do it in I would say the more straightforward way Kettering would say is by having, several of these forums in the community, you're developing the local political will to help policymakers implement the guided transformation, assuming that it's some sort of decision maker, policy maker who is going to lead some of these efforts. It may not be. I think it would be highly malleable depending on what the topic is, where the guided transformation state is. But that's what I would see. And does that fit within the time space of the TN funded? I don't know. It may be, do we mobilize getting the guides developed and ready? And how do we hand that off to communities to help them take that themselves? And that could be something where, coming again from the extension, the land grant university, is that the opportunity where we're trying to build that capacity post TN funding. I think that all would be up for discussion and continuum based on, how many guides, what topics, where.
Yeah, I just want, before Mindy hops on. So one of the things that a few of us have been talking about is kind of helping focus the TN through hosting some kind of topical synthesis workshops or efforts. And I think this could be an interesting part that ties into that if we thought strategically about it. I don't know if it would be something that was a part of that type of workshop or if it would come before or after. But I like the idea. So thanks for sharing, Brad.
Yeah, and happy to discuss further as, how we, yes, which is the right order, if this makes sense. And I would agree, it seems like there's an opportunity there, so indeed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad. Kind of as you were talking about the product, and as I understood it, was like, maybe helping communities sort of think through kind of where they want to go, what they want, of their trajectories that they want to be, like where they want their landing place to be, in terms of their new system state. It kind of got me thinking about the guided transformations paper that we're currently writing for Ecology and Society, because we have a new kind of version of the figure that you showed at the very beginning that that might be helpful for people to see. If people wanted to see a kind of the current draft of that, would people be interested in kind of taking a peek at that, to sort of think about kind of how that might fit with kind of what we're talking about a little bit? I don't know, would anybody be interested in seeing that?
I would. I'm not as familiar with what that paper is, so a revised
So-
draft would be.
Let me
Great.
I want to see if I can share my screen. Okay. So, and it's too bad Alex dropped off because she's key to this. But basically the idea, kind of thinking about in terms of what we were just talking about, is that if you think about working with a community, you could kind of start with the community, helping them kind of build a mental map of this is basically just a reworking of the figure that was shown at the very beginning, but putting it in terms of a basin of attraction model here. And this is sort of the major kind of concepts of working within the transformation network, using regime change, window of opportunity, and then guided transformation. So the idea would be to like work with communities to first think about the mental map of their current situation, or their, where kind of the historic conditions that they're kind of living in, and where are they at right now in terms of their system states, where they want to be. And then thinking about sort of the regime changes or system trajectories that they're kind of facing, and then what we call kind of lock-ins, or maybe ways in which the current system or current states might be kind of locking them into current conditions that they don't necessarily want to sort of be in. So a lock-in is basically a technology or a system element that becomes dominant or difficult to change, even though it might not be efficient or effective. So like an example in a forest system might be management practices of forest suppression or something. And then a window of opportunity might be something that allows them to move into a different trajectory. And then the innovation or transformation is then moving into a more desired system state. So this is where there's sort of an opportunity of helping the community sort of think about how to get kind of where they want to go, kind of moving their existing basin into something different. So I'd be happy to share this with anybody who's wants to take a closer look, but it's just sort of a quick kind of overview, and then we're providing some examples from work within the TN currently. But one thought is, I think particularly this idea of lock-in, like helping communities think about where are you locked in, like what is it you're doing now, that is sort of what is it about your food practices, or what is it about your current management practices, or what is it about, like I'm thinking about like you guys, Renya, like in the Mora situation, like what is it about how the federal government gives money to people in disasters, that is locking us into ways of being that is just dysfunctional. What kind of regime changes are needed, and how we distribute resources post-disaster, to transform at a different scale, that kind of thing. So like the disaster in Mora, from the Hermes Peak Less Conscious Fire could end up transforming how we delivered post-disaster aid, as a result of just how horrible that whole process has gone. So I'll stop talking now and just.
Yeah, and I think that's a great connection. I think you envisioned how the process could fit within the theoretical frame of the TN. And I would also just want to state that, I sort of explained kind of Kettering and Nephi's approach to this process. We can adapt that process as necessary. It's sort of just the concept of how do we support guided transformation? And it felt like this could be a very good framework by which to work through of how do you, create some sort of durable product to help community have a discussion, understand the issues, the trade-offs, the opportunities, get consensus that would then support activities that people would want to take, recognizing there's going to be trade-offs, and people recognize that up front versus after the fact where they just throw rocks at ideas because, well, you didn't think about this, or what about this? Whereas where they've been involved in the process and understand there is no perfect solution. We're going to have trade-offs. I've had the discussion. I'm willing to accept those trade-offs to try to get us to this preferred state. So those of you who are charter leaders or cross-cutting themes or whatever, thoughts? Kelly, I think you're involved in sort of maybe an interesting one of the wildfire and socio-ecological. I mean, do you see something like this kind of fitting in and within your charter, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, and I was looking at some of the issue guides. I pulled up the website and was taking a glance at them. I mean, I think it's an interesting approach, and I think it's something the TN, if we find the right issue, right, maybe it's the fuels mitigation issue, and there's a lot of controversy over where we should do it, how much we should do it, the ecological trade-offs versus the impact if we have a fire. I mean, if we can identify the right issue and the right stakeholder groups where there's a need or an openness, right, to having those discussions and change, I think it could be a nice way, as people have talked about, to synthesize, right, the research, the science that we're producing. I guess my questions and concerns, but just we have to find those stakeholders in those communities, right, that are open to having those discussions. And the temporal process, which you started to touch on, I think with Julie's question, was one of my big questions, right? It's like, it doesn't seem like it's just a one-off discussion, right, about these trade-offs, but that who follows that process? So do we have decision makers who are going to be able to follow that process, right, once the initial discussions begin? So that it's not just a forum where people come in, maybe learn a lot, discuss trade-offs, but then it just stops, right? I guess that's the one thing I would want to make sure, that there is someone to carry that process and that discussion forward to make sure there is guided transformation or something happens with that knowledge and information. I've never done anything like this. We did some kind of role play, kind of scenarios with science in a project I did in Mexico, where we took a lot of the science we had developed, we created scenarios, and we had people come together and play different roles, right? If you were a rancher, you might play someone who lives in the city, to understand again, right, that we come at these issues and these topics with different perspectives, and to help build empathy and to think about those trade-offs. And the decision makers, the government was there, and some of the non-government organizations, they found it very valuable. But then I think the challenge that I saw was then it was kind of a one-off thing. So then what happened with that information, right? And so I guess that was just my biggest question about this process. But I certainly think could be a good way to synthesize our science, and if we can identify those right charters, but maybe it's bigger than a charter, exemplars or groups where they really need this, and that we can help facilitate the beginning, but that they're going to carry that on. I think it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and a couple of things is, one, yeah, this is, I don't envision this being a requirement, a mandate. Is it a tool that would work in the right circumstances? And just saying that it's a tool I'm willing to help facilitate, build, cultivate for the TN, because I think I think it has promise, but again, in the right spot. And then maybe using your example to build a little bit on my answer to Philip's question is, one of the projects that one of my colleagues had done kind of in this space was kind of a resource allocation that a governmental entity would make was hotly disputed in the community by different factions. So they brought the community together to have these type of discussions to hear for themselves, right? So you've got the ranch owner, you've got the forestry, you've got the person living in the subdivision, right? And they're all trying to understand the trade-offs of the different fuel loads and how you manage that. Well, the political entity who was going to make the decisions moving forward were in the room, and they were specifically told, you can interject to clarify, sort of facts. No, we don't do that. That's not our role, it's this role, or, this is how something is done. So they can clarify data. But then they were there to really listen to the community, and that built for them to know, oh, I understand the trade-offs. I heard it from the real people. And I know who I can speak to represent these. But it also gives them political cover to say, we listened, we heard, the community debated, we got consensus that this is the direction the community is wanting to go. So it put the policymakers in the perspective to be the ones to carry it on, knowing they've got some dedicated community members who are willing to participate, have the conversation, and they've got the data to say, we didn't just make this up and give, what's your 3-minute, feedback at a county council meeting on this idea, right? It's sort of that richer, authentic community engagement by which it gives them the cover to say, and this is why we're doing X. So in the right place, I think that's how these can kind of fit together and nest fairly well.
And maybe you guys have had those conversations, Mindy or Courtney. I mean, the one thing that came to my mind was, having talked with Alex, was the Santa Fe watershed and the conflict amongst some of the groups. I mean, is this something that you think would fit there, or?
You read my mind. I was thinking about the Santa Fe and some of, especially the issue related to the project that they have. But I don't think that I think it seems to me that this issue would have been maybe more appropriate if there had been conversation further upstream of the decision making related to that. I think that that the decision makers related to are a little too far downstream with regard to the decision making on that project at this stage.
Yeah, I agree, Mindy. I one of the things that has been rumbling around in my head on this is it feels a little bit like the expert bringing the ideas to a community, or bringing a process in as an expert, or as someone with potential array of answers, and with this, I don't know, it has a little bit of the connotation of, you need this, so please join us on this process. I'm sure that I'm overplaying that just to make a point. I would say that a community like Santa Fe, a lot of those folks would say, we don't need that. We know what our issues are. We know all about them. We know, and maybe they need some conflict mediation, and maybe they need some process for sure. But this seems like maybe more appropriate when a researcher or something has something to bring to a community that may not necessarily be already primed for it, like bringing something in. I don't know, maybe I'm misreading this a little bit, but it for me, this whole guided transformation thing, the big question for me is who's guiding this transformation? And I think a lot of communities would really struggle with the idea of someone from the outside guiding their transformation. Although what I'm hearing is that this is about facilitating a process by which they bring their own thoughts and reactions to this, and you're facilitating their process. So it's not entirely that info in to that process, but I don't know, those are some of my rambling reactions, and I have overstated a few things on purpose just to see what you say, Brett.
I don't disagree, and with your overstatements, I think that's the nuance I also see of trying to make sure that happens. This is, I think the way Kettering and Nephi would normally develop these, the idea is they work with, a pilot community or whatever, that's co-created, and then it's allowed to be utilized in other communities. So you feel that it's not just the sage on the stage saying these are the answers, that it's been this process a bit. But I think, in kind of rediscovering this and listening to some of the TN conversations, I'm like, oh, this, is trying to think through those questions you were asking. How do we help ensure that, yes, it's not who's the guide in the guided transformation, right? And is this a way by which the science work that's being done is grounding of information, opportunities, directions? Here's what we see, but I would like it to be the community who's doing the guided, but with appropriate information, right? That's our role in the TN, is to provide the right amount of information and process to help them decide where they want to be and how to get there.
Yeah, I'll just jump right back in though and say that some communities are open to that kind of scientific information flow and others are not. And then there's a spectrum in between. And so navigating where a community, which I put in quotes because I think we kind of over, that's why I asked the question of what is a community.
Yeah.
I think it can be homogenizing, right? The term. And I think we have wildly eclectic, divergent, heterogeneous people that may be part of this. And I think we want to be careful about that. But sometimes some of those interests are not open to a scientific perspective, nor do they believe it's important. And so how do you wrestle with that along the way? But anyway,
Yeah.
Jody's got his hand.
Before Jody hops in, I guess my answer would go a little bit back to Kelly's response is this isn't a panacea for everything, right? So recognize if you've got a community that is not open to scientific input, or they're locked into battle, this probably is not the right opportunity or solution or product or process, right? It's got to be deployed in the right space. And I would think you try to get to communities before you need mediation, right? This is trying to get to communities to get them together before they get into a spot where, you need something like the Ruckelshaus Center to come in and mediate a solution. But Jody.
Hi, everybody. Courtney, I hear you. And I can only say that when I was working with a group of extension folks doing a Kettering process, which was based around this kind of deliberative process, it was a very, very community-based process. I don't think that the community felt like they were being guided, at least not in the sense that, they were being forced into a process they didn't agree with. Ours was about bringing art into the thinking process, and I won't go into the details, but at the same, but I can just say that they were very, very, very involved, and that it crossed. We had people who were working with children, with youth. We had people who were working with diverse adult groups. It really crossed a lot of boundaries, and I felt like it had a lot of interesting and valuable work come out of it. I think that that idea of having follow through with the leaders is leadership, whichever leadership that happens to be, is a great idea, and I definitely think that needs to be part of it. But I definitely don't think this would be something for, if you need two groups who are at blows. No, I don't think this is the process. But they offer, NIFI offers training for the facilitators. And I think that they would be appalled if a facilitator went ahead and chose to step in and say, hey, it's my process, this is the way you'll do it. That would really upset them. So I would just say that I think that there's supposed to be a lot of work with, not work over. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, Jody, thank you. That is helpful. And I think what I also wanted to say was that I think as a sort of a template that then can be adapted and adjusted in different circumstances, I think it's a tremendously great place to start. I think that the as long as it's presented in a way that one size isn't going to fit all, and you have to adjust and adapt and understand the nuances of the setting in which you're working, then I think that the spirit of it is useful and great.
Yeah, I think that's a great description of what it's supposed to look like, at least in my experience.
Mindy?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to speak to this issue of guided transformations and this question of like who's doing the guiding, because I think that's an important question for us as a network, as we, kind of articulated guided transformations as being a theoretical framework for the TN. And I think that just to back up a little bit, I think the original idea behind guided transformations, as people remember, is the idea that these are all systems that are undergoing regime changes, and that they're undergoing different trajectories. And as you think about the different trajectories, the idea is there a capacity for communities to choose among these trajectories? Are there opportunities amongst these trajectories? Sometimes you don't have, maybe sometimes you're just going down a different trajectory. There's no choice. Is there potential to guide or have some guide to the transformations that are occurring? But then if there is, then I think this important question is, then who and how, right? I think it reminds me of, the critiques of resilience theory. More generally, resilience is one of the theoretical frameworks underlying guided transformations, along with a couple of others that we won't go into now. But one of the critiques of resilience has been that it looks at resilience of what and to what, but it doesn't often enough look at for whom. And so within the TN, we ask that question. We ask the questions of resilience for whom. In other words, who's in the room when you're thinking about what the system identity is, and who's being served by this concept of resilience. But then also this question of how are you building resilience? And so I think those two really toggle together very well as you think about this idea of guiding resilience. And, as we think about within the TN, we work within systems focusing on headwater dependent communities, and we focus on systems regarding food, energy, water systems. But within that, the main tools and approaches that we think about them within, we focus on adaptive governance, participatory strategies, and well-being. And we look at underrepresentations within that. We look at, those types of issues. We look at the ways in which people are or are not participating within collaboratives and other ways, being seen. And how are new strategies emerging? And so I think that is an important question for us, as these innovations start to emerge, to guide the transformations, is what's behind those innovations. Are they just, and obviously I think we have our own biases about what we want those to look like, right? But they aren't necessarily, they're never value neutral, that's for sure. So I think that that's an important observation to sort of continue to be self-reflective about.
Great. Well, we are over time by just a few minutes. And so we'll give you all a little breather in between what I'm sure is a next meeting or other responsibility. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Thanks, super interesting.
For facilitating, Leanne, and thank you, Brad, so much for presenting. Really appreciate you. Appreciate all the conversations.